Boeing 747 was completely ready to take off on the runway. Amidst thick fog, the pilot pushed the thrust levers forward, turned on the headlights, and the aircraft had now crossed takeoff speed, a speed at which turning back becomes almost impossible. But right at that moment, a shadow began to appear through the fog, and it was the shadow of another Boeing 747, which was now just a few meters away on the same runway, coming from the opposite direction. What happened next is almost impossible to even imagine. The question is, how did things get to this point? What was the air traffic controller doing? And what was that one small mistake that led to the most dangerous accident in aviation history? This tragic story unfolded in Spain's Canary Islands, which the world now remembers as the Tenerife airport disaster. The story begins one day before the accident, on March 26, 1977, when Pan Am Flight 1736, a Boeing 747 jumbo jet, takes off from Los Angeles Airport. It was supposed to land in New York to pick up some passengers, and then its final destination was the city of Las Palmas in the Canary Islands, across the ocean. This was a charter flight, and for that reason it was fully booked, mostly with older passengers who planned to enjoy a cruise ship in Las Palmas. Las Palmas is the capital of the Canary Islands, which is about 100 kilometers from the coast of Morocco. It is the southernmost part of Spain, and this place is quite famous around the world for its tropical climate. But in 1977, behind the beautiful facade of the Canary Islands, there was a hidden political tension. Here, a group called MPAYAC was raising its voice for the independence of the Canary Islands from Spain, and for their campaign, this group often resorted to violence. It was one such violent event that set off the chain of events leading to this dangerous accident. Pan Am Flight 1736 picked up passengers from New York's JFK International Airport and took off. Heading towards Las Palmas Island, the cabin crew included 56-year-old Captain Victor Grubbs, 39-year-old First Officer Robert Bragg, and 46-year-old Flight Engineer George Warren, along with 13 flight attendants and 380 passengers. These were all the details of Pan Am Flight 1736, which was now cruising over the Atlantic Ocean. Now let's turn to the other aircraft that was also destined to be involved in this accident. At Amsterdam Airport in the Netherlands, KLM Flight 4805 was getting ready. This was also a Boeing 747, and it too was headed to Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. In its cockpit were 50-year-old Captain Jacob, 42-year-old First Officer Klaas, and 48-year-old Flight Engineer Willem. There were 11 flight attendants and 235 passengers on board. After boarding, KLM Flight 4805 took off from Amsterdam International Airport. Now, both aircraft were on their way to Las Palmas Airport in the Canary Islands. Meanwhile, at Las Palmas Airport, two men approached the terminal building and left a bag outside a flower shop before disappearing. It was a bag with a bomb attached to a countdown timer. Exactly at 1 p.m., a phone call comes in at the reception of Las Palmas Airport. The person on the other end identified himself as being from the MPAYAC group, the same group mentioned at the beginning of the video, and said that a bomb blast was going to happen at Las Palmas Airport in the next 15 minutes. The airport staff sprang into action immediately and managed to evacuate the entire Las Palmas Airport before the 15 minutes were up. Their rush turned into fear when, exactly 15 minutes later, a powerful explosion occurred. The blast caused a large part of the terminal building's roof to collapse. After that, all activities at Las Palmas Airport were suspended. All flights were canceled, and the flights that were supposed to land there were diverted. A little while later, KLM Flight 4805, coming from Amsterdam, was approaching Las Palmas, but the air traffic controller informed them about the explosion at the airport and instructed the flight to land at Tenerife Islands Airport, which was 110 kilometers away. After another 25 minutes of flying, the KLM captain landed on runway 30 at Tenerife Airport at exactly 1:38 p.m. At exactly the same time, Pan Am Flight 1736 coming from New York was also approaching Las Palmas, and it too was diverted to Tenerife Airport. At that point, almost all flights were being diverted to Tenerife Airport because it was the closest airport available. Now, the rush at Tenerife Airport was increasing rapidly. Let us tell you here that Tenerife Airport is a small airport located in a mountainous area, very close to the Atlantic Ocean, at an elevation of around 2,000 feet. This area is surrounded by high mountains, and because of this, when the moist winds from the Atlantic Ocean hit the mountains and rise upward, they quickly cool down and turn into clouds. And all of this happening suddenly here is actually very normal. When the Pan Am flight and the KLM flight landed at Tenerife Airport, visibility was perfectly fine, but now suddenly visibility had dropped because of the clouds. When the clouds were over the runway, visibility would drop to as little as 300 meters, and in the very next moment, everything up to 2 kilometers away would be clearly visible. At this point, it wasn't confirmed how long they would have to stay at the airport. The passengers were deplaned so they could freshen up after the long flight. Meanwhile, the KLM Flight 4805, which was supposed to return to Amsterdam, decided to refuel right there so that when Las Palmas Airport reopened, they wouldn't waste time refueling there. They had just started refueling when the news came that Las Palmas had reopened. Both flights reboarded their passengers, but because of KLM's refueling, the taxiway was blocked. Tenerife Airport is a small airport with only one runway, one taxiway, and one apron, where the terminal is located, as you can see in this animation. Having such a heavy rush here was quite abnormal, especially with jumbo jets like the Boeings. Because of KLM Flight 4805's refueling, Pan Am couldn't leave the terminal and get onto the runway. They were told that until KLM's refueling was complete, they would have to wait near the terminal. At 4:45, KLM finished refueling and the captain began preparing to move off the taxiway. But the apron was filled with other planes which were also blocking the taxiway. So, to get to the east end of the runway for takeoff, the controller instructed the KLM pilots, who were parked on the far west side of the taxiway, to taxi directly on the runway to the extreme east end, make a 180-degree turn, and get ready for takeoff. When KLM 4805 started taxiing, the controller instructed Pan Am to follow KLM on the runway, but to exit onto the taxiway at C3, because KLM 4805 was supposed to take off from that same runway. Visibility was very low and getting worse by the minute. KLM 4805 taxied all the way down the runway, reached the eastern end, made a 180-degree turn, and got into takeoff position. The Pan Am pilot also started taxiing on the runway, but because of the fog, they could see the C1 and C2 exits but missed the C3 exit, since C3 led back toward the apron. Maybe that's why they didn't see C3 at all. Another issue was the lack of sign markings at Tenerife Airport. Usually, there are signs on the tarmac for runway exits, but here those signs were missing. When Pan Am Flight 1736 was crossing C2, at that very moment, the KLM 4805 captain asked the control tower for takeoff clearance. And this is where a series of back-to-back confusions began. Because of the fog, The control tower couldn't see either plane, and there was no radar system installed at this airport. At this point, the control tower started telling KLM what route to take after takeoff, but nowhere in the message did they actually give takeoff clearance. But KLM thought they had received clearance, and the KLM captain replied, "We are at takeoff." Now, it's still unclear whether he said, "We are at takeoff," or "We are taking off." In response, the control tower said, "Okay." But just a few seconds later, the control tower clarified, "Stand by for takeoff. I will call you." This was a very important message, clearly stating not to take off yet. But this message never reached the KLM cockpit because at that exact moment, near C3 on the runway, the Pan Am 1736 pilot, who was listening to the whole conversation, also relayed a message. "We are still down the runway." That means the control tower's message to KLM to stand by and Pan Am's message were both transmitted at the same time, causing only a distorted sound to be heard in the KLM cockpit. Pan Am 1736, which had unknowingly crossed C3, was told by the control tower to inform them when they exited the runway, to which the Pan Am pilot replied, "Okay." But by this time, the KLM 4805 captain had already pushed the thrust levers forward, thinking they had received clearance from the control tower. At this point, the KLM flight engineer had heard the control tower's message to Pan Am and immediately told the captain that Pan Am was still on the runway. But for some reason, the captain, perhaps misunderstanding in the noise, just said, "Oh yes," and continued with the takeoff. Because of the fog, they could only see about 300 meters ahead. At that moment, the Pan Am pilot suddenly saw headlights through the fog on the runway. At first, he thought maybe the KLM flight was stopped, but in the next instant, he realized it was coming straight at them at high speed. He immediately tried to turn the plane, but it was too late. KLM's right engine tore through Pan Am's first base section. The landing gear broke off, and the plane crashed about 150 meters down the runway, bursting into a terrifying fire. Since its fuel tank was completely full, you can imagine how intense the fire was. All 248 people on board died instantly. The Pan Am passengers didn't even have time to realize what had happened. The first-class passengers died on the spot, but several economy-class passengers managed to escape through a hole in the roof. Many jumped from a height of 20 feet to save their lives. Out of Pan Am's 396 passengers, only 61 survived. Maybe more could have survived, but because of the fog, the control tower only learned about the accident after a delay. That too, only when another plane parked on the apron saw the flames on the runway and informed the control tower. The rescue vehicles also couldn't move quickly because of the fog. In this disaster, a total of 583 lives were lost in the blink of an eye. The investigation examined both planes' cockpit voice recorders, and that's how all the details you saw in this video came to light. The investigation team concluded that there was a chain of events behind this disaster. First, the bomb blast at Las Palmas. Then KLM blocking the taxiway at Tenerife by refueling. If they hadn't done that, Pan Am 1736 would have taken off first. Then, the sudden drop in visibility and Pan Am missing the C3 exit. But the investigation team held the KLM 4805 crew responsible for the accident, because after all, they continued with takeoff without clearance, even though the flight engineer had tried to stop the captain just 5 seconds earlier. The Tenerife airport disaster proved to be a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry. After this tragedy, many changes were made in aviation. Call signs were changed, their rules were updated. Radar was made mandatory at all airports, and holding points and indicators on runways were required. Today, there are 2 airports on Tenerife Island. The site of the disaster is now the Northern Airport, while a new airport has been built in the south at a lower elevation, where visibility is not affected by clouds and fog.